Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into Unity's powerful terrain tools, a set of features that let you sculpt, texture, and detail large-scale environments with ease. Whether you're creating rolling hills, dense forests, or rugged mountains, these tools give you everything you need to build immersive worlds. In this video, we'll go over the basics of terrain creation, sculpting techniques, painting textures, and adding details like grass and trees. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started with our landscape and take a look at how we can integrate that into our 3D game kit. So terrain is one of those special things that game engines give us access to. And we can find it by coming up here to Game Object. We can go to 3D Objects here, and in here we can create a terrain. Now, creating a terrain out of context of the scene can be quite challenging, so it's usually good to have some things with scale in there. And we'll take a look at that, but we're going to do this in a new scene, just kind of as a sandbox to play around with the tool to understand how it works. So make sure you're not in one of your main scenes when you're doing this, just open a fresh one, and let's go ahead and take a look at this tool. If you go ahead and click terrain, what we're going to get is a very large tessellated polygon plane. And it has a special script attached to it, which is the terrain script. We can see that over here in our inspector and in our components. And this is going to be what we interact with Unity's terrain. To give us a sense of scale, let me go ahead and create a basic game object like a capsule and just hit the F key so you can understand just how immense this is. All right, this terrain is very large. If this capsule represented our little character, and let me get it set to 0, 0, 0. You would see this is the scale of this capsule compared to this world. So when we're working with terrains, this is really how open worlds are constructed. If you think of like Zelda Breath of the Wild, that entire expanse is going to be utilized creating terrains. And there's a lot of different ways we can approach terrains. We're going to take a look at it manually, building them up with the tools inside of here. But there's external applications you can also use to create maps to drive terrains, and you can also use height maps to drive terrains. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it. And my career, the main way I've used it is through the means of sculpting inside of Unity. So let's take a look at these tools so you can understand the basics. And if you would like to dive in more, you can always explore more depending on the needs of the projects you're working on. Now, the first thing to be aware of is there's several different modes in the terrain that we have access to, and we only see these with this selected. Remember, the way objects work inside of Unity is they have different components attached in the inspector, and that's going to be what we're seeing over here. If we hover over these, we can get a feel for what these are. The first one's interesting, which is create neighboring terrain. These are terrain patches, and if you want to add more terrain, you can by clicking on this and adding more and more patches to grow your world. So you don't have to use a singular patch, you can use multiple. And this can have some advantages in the respect that with individual patches, you can set it up for them to be cold when they're off screen, so you could unload chunks of the level. With a singular terrain, because it's all one geometric surface, you can't exactly tell the game engine to not render portions. So having these separate patches can help with that. We're not going to get to that today, but it's a cool feature that this has, and it can be quite useful. The next section here is going to be our paint terrain tools, and this is going to be primarily what we work with today. The paint terrain tools are going to allow us to sculpt and to texture our terrain. Then we have some really nice tools like the Paint Tree tool, and we'll see if we can integrate some of the 3D Game Kit trees here. If not, we can always grab some off the Unity Asset Store. And we also have a Paint Details. This one's going to be for painting cards, which are essentially polygon planes that can move, as well as other things like rocks I believe you can paint with this. And then lastly, we have the Terrain Settings, which is a beast of a category in itself here, but there's a lot going on. Now, it's a good idea to kind of start in the terrain settings. As a full disclaimer, what I suggest doing if you really want to get a good solid understanding of these terrain settings is pull up the Unity documentation and read through it to gain a full understanding for yourself of what all of these are going to be doing. There are some things that can be useful off the bat though, in terms of working with this. So let's go ahead and take a look, for example, at the resolution on the terrain. This is an area that can be useful starting out. This is the terrain width, length, height, detail per patch, and detail resolution. I think these are kind of self-explanatory, but in short, this is how big this is. Now, you saw how big that scene was compared to a capsule. We could probably dial this back quite a bit to maybe something smaller like 200 by 200. And you can see that will shrink that down nicely, so we're not dealing with such an immense space. You could also change the terrain height. This is actually how high your highest mountain can go. So be mindful that you can change that there. And then when it comes to detail resolution and per patch, just like with any other game asset, this is going to be the resolution, and the lower, the less quality, but the better performance, right? Now, these really have to be dialed in and fine-tuned for whatever platform you're delivering on, so just be mindful of that. So those are probably the main categories that I would concern ourselves with for now. There's other really cool stuff you can do in this menu. For example, this is where you can actually input different types of maps if you want to drive this. But let's go ahead and leave the settings for now. And like I mentioned, go read the documentation on this if you really want an in-depth look at these settings. But let's dive in and start playing around with these. I'm going to come here to the Paint Terrain tool. And the Paint Terrain tool is going to be mainly where we're going to be working. You can see here we have a drop-down menu, and by default, it should be on set height. But you can see we have some different settings we can work in. We can set height, we can smooth height, we can stamp terrain, paint terrain, raise and lower terrain, and paint holes. Some of these are somewhat newer, but let's go ahead and explore these. The set height's going to be where we start, and we have some basic settings here that we can play around with. You have a space to operate in. That's your standard 3D space. You'll see it's at world by default. But if you go ahead and switch this, you can see you can switch it to local. We'll keep it on world. And then when it comes to height here, we can actually set this to a particular height. We can flatten tile, we can flatten all, which is interesting. So for example, if I go ahead and set this to 0 and flatten all, it will flatten everything to 0. And I'll set this to 100 just so we can see this. I'm going to brush here, and if I go ahead and hit flatten tile, you'll see it'll flatten that to 100. But if I have it set to 0, it will flatten down to 0. So that's what the flatten's going to do. Now, you're probably wondering, how did I just do that thing? That thing's called sculpting, and what it does is it utilizes this brush here. Now, these are different alphas that Unity starts with. You can utilize any of these various alphas. And as you might already be aware, there is a new brush button right here where you can create a new brush using your own alpha if you would like. So you can import more brushes. There's a brush size and a brush opacity. Size is how large it is, and brush opacity is how opaque it is. So we can use this here to scale the size and change the size of our brush. You can also use the same hotkeys as Photoshop for this, which is the bracket keys, which is kind of cool. That works for the brush size. So we can make that bigger and smaller. And then when it comes to opacity, it's how much it adds. So I'll set it to 100 just so you can see right now how much it adds. And if I paint, you'll notice it's actually not adding anything. And this is kind of the trick. How much is it adding of what, right? That's where the height comes in. So the height isn't just for flattening and setting a certain height. This is actually the height of the brush as we're painting. So for example, if I wanted this to just have 1 unit, I could set this to 1. And now with an opacity of 1 and a brush size of 1, every time I click, we're going to be raising this by 1 unit up to a maximum of 1. So that's the interesting thing here, right? Up to a maximum of 1, notice I use that term. That is going to be what the height is going to set, is the maximum we could go to. But let's say I had this set to 100 and I clicked. You'll see this is going to go all the way up to 100, but it also will build up to 100 based on the opacity. So if I have this set to 1, it will build up to 1, and it's very easy to get to 1. 100, not so much. So you can set the maximum height of your brushes here, and then you can utilize the opacity to kind of just come in here and build these up. Now, this works best with a Wacom tablet because it does actually take into consider pressure sensitivity, I believe. But we could build up our terrain here, and I'd probably want to have even less opacity and maybe even a bigger brush to kind of build something that we can look at. So you can see, kind of neat. Just like that, we're getting some mountains. And it really won't look like much till you get your textures in there, but you can see that we are getting a terrain here, which is all that really matters. Now, you can play around with the different alphas. They all have different purposes. This flat one here is not too great, but it's good for like plateaus and pathways. These lumpier ones, they're better for creating just kind of base textures and like rolling hills if you want to have more variety. So you can experiment with these to kind of see what looks good, what feels good, and gives you a better look in terms of your terrain. Taking a look at some of these other settings here, we have smooth height. If you switch to the smooth brush, what it will do is it will smooth things out. So you might see this hard edge here. If I go ahead and use a smooth brush, this will gradually reduce these. And just to make it more visible, I'll set that to 100. But you'll see it's going to essentially smooth out and remove those details. The stamp terrain will actually create stamps of things. So if you had a specific structure you wanted to do, like you wanted this to be an alien structure, we could change the stamp height here, and you can see it will actually just stamp that into there, like so. So this is a very useful tool if you want to get very specific structures into your terrain. These probably aren't the best examples, but if you had like specific mountain alphas, you could definitely get those in there. When it comes to paint texture, we'll get to that in a second. There's a raise or lower terrain here. This will allow you to raise or lower as you sculpt, and this is a bit different than the set height. The set height sets it to a determined height. The raise or lower does it intuitively. So this is where your opacity is going to matter a little bit more. It's going to be where this actually builds up. And more importantly, you can hold down Shift to remove. So I could use Shift to go in the opposite direction and actually bring that height back down. And you can see this becomes a little bit more intuitive than just the set height. The set height is very useful for level building, though. It gives you a lot more control than painting, so each has its own purpose. This also is kind of neat because if I wanted to carve a pathway, for example, let's say I wanted a pathway through the hills here, I could utilize this tool to do so, and now I can create kind of this, indented area for something like a river, or, maybe this is the pathway the character follows. Now, with that said, this might be where I come in and use some smoothing to kind of clean this up a bit, so it's not all jaggedy here. And I'd want to set my opacity higher than this. So we could get something more gradual and worn down. But you can see how that tool will work there, which is pretty useful to kind of do things more intuitively, the raise or lower terrain. Lastly, paint holes is not something we're going to play with. I'm probably going to Control-Z this, but just to show you what paint holes will do, is it will actually paint a hole in your mesh, in the actual mesh itself. This has some uses. You can use it to cull things. So for example, on a project I used in the past, I did use this to cull the back faces that weren't going to be seen by the camera, since we had a static camera and we were mainly using the terrain for a background element. This is a newer feature to Unity, so I haven't worked with it too much, but it is in there if you do need to use it. And you can probably find other creative uses. For example, if we wanted to insert a cave into here, we could create this hole, and then we could build up our cave geometry around it, and that would be a separate mesh, or maybe even a separate terrain if we wanted to try using a terrain for a cave. So that's the basic sculpting tools that we have access to inside of here. The next thing I want to talk about is the paint texture tool, which is actually going to allow us to paint the textures of our terrain. One of the unique things about terrain is that it is painted inside of Unity. It's not something we do externally like a lot of the other 3D elements. So if you come in here to paint textures, it's going to bring us to a menu that's not terribly useful. If you try and paint, you're probably not going to get anywhere. And the reason why is there's a few things we need to do to get this set up. One of the things we need to do here is come into this Edit Layers section, and we need to create a layer. A layer is some sort of a texture that we can utilize. Now, I have the Unity 3D Game Kit set up, so we should have some textures that we can access, but we may need to bring up our own. If you go ahead and click on this Edit Layers here, we'll have the option to create layer or add layer. Now, when you don't have any layers, the first thing you need to do is create layer. And from here, we can select something that we can utilize. Now, I might look for tile if there's tileables, and you'll see there's a tiled rock in this 3D game kit. I can go ahead and select this tiled rock, and it will now apply this to our entire mesh. So what we'll see here now is this tiled texture being textured throughout this entire asset. The other thing you'll notice is down here in our assets, we have a new layers section. It would be a good idea to organize these into other layers so we could take advantage of it and to also name them. So I could go ahead and make this something like the 3D Game Kit Tiled Rock. Now, when I click on this texture, notice something happened here in the inspector. We actually have an insert not only for the diffuse, but we have for the normal and for something called a mask map. Now, a normal map's pretty straightforward. If we go ahead and add in the normal map here, I'll go ahead and type in tile again, since we know this is the tiled rock. That will apply the normal map, and now you'll see we're getting a bit of a bump to it. Doesn't seem like this tiles perfectly, but it's fine for what we need. And then the mask map's a little bit different. The mask map's going to deal with the specular roughness controls, and the terrain has its own use of sRGB for that. I don't think we have the proper textures here. You could find it in the Unity documentation. If I go and input, the roughness map here, it might give us an okay result. And then down here, we can play around with various things like the specular color, metallic, smoothness, all that type of stuff to kind of adjust this. But if I go ahead and come into this mask, for example, here that I put into the mask map and remove this, you'll notice it's actually not going to change anything because it's not the right type of map that we're inputting. So we need to make our own special one here. So we'll leave that off for now, but we can use these if you want to dial this in. Probably shouldn't have any metalness, but we could adjust the smoothness here to give it some variety or make it have some specular property that it doesn't normally have. Okay, so how do we create more of these layers? When we come in here now, we can come to the edit texture, and now we could go ahead and add a layer, which would allow us to load in a texture layer, which we only have one of. So in this case, we need to create another layer by going to create layer. And in this case, I might look for something like grass and see if the 3D game kit has anything resembling grass. It has this, but that's not really great. I could maybe look up texture. Doesn't look like it has much in the way of that either. So this is where we might need to create our own texture to go with this. It'd be good if we had something that matched the 3D game kit, but it never hurts to figure out how to create our own texture. This might work though, this mossy albedo. So let's see if we can utilize this mossy albedo. I'll type in moss here and just see. And it doesn't hurt to try creating a layer. So we'll just go ahead and create one utilizing this. Same situation here. If you come down into your 3D game kit and your assets, you'll see it's going to create a new terrain layer, which I need to figure out where it's putting that. We might have to search for that. But let's go ahead and edit this. You can see we can edit it in here as well. If I just come in here and select moss, we can go ahead and find the moss normal, and we can input that there. And now that we have this here, we can actually paint it. So this is the advantage. Whatever layer you're on, you're going to paint. And I could come in here and click to paint this moss layer now. So if we go ahead and take a look at that, you'll see how that's transitioning between these two. Now, it looks pretty awful, but we do what we can with what we have, right? So that's going to allow us to come in here and paint these. So if we want to play around with this, we can play around with things like opacity here, and we could utilize, maybe one of these soft brushes, but you can actually build this up opaquely here and play around with having partial fades, I guess you could say, between these. So I'll go ahead and paint a bit of this moss. And if we go ahead and take a look at this now, you can see that we have different opacities, and that's actually blending between these two materials. Now, the number of materials you use does matter. The more materials you have on this thing, the more aggressive it's going to use your memory on your computer. So yes, you can paint a spectacular looking scene, but depending on your output format, you might have a harder time getting super detailed terrains. A good case study for this is if you look at Pokemon Legends Arceus. If any of you played that game, they utilize a similar terrain tool. I wouldn't even be surprised if it was Unity. The game kind of looked very similar to Unity. And at the time, I had been working with terrain quite a bit on a mobile game. And mobile games are relatively similar to something like the Switch, right? The Switch is not a next-gen console. Honestly, it's kind of a strange miracle device, in my opinion, that it can do what it does. But they very likely had a lot of the constraints that we had. And one of the constraints that I ran into is on any terrain square, I was only allowed to use 2 individual textures. So, for example, I'd have to make this look as good as possible with just 2 texture inputs here. So I was counting the number of textures they had on their terrain swatches, and it actually looked very similar to what I was dealing with, which is interesting. So I have a feeling, one of the reasons that game, the community was a little bit critical of its visuals is because it's dealing with a lot of the same constraints in mobile. And you might be saying, hey, what about other games? Well, what it comes down to is other games probably have better technical engineers that are building tools. Because when it comes to working with terrains like this, a lot of the times to optimize it, you have to use proprietary tool sets, which means things built in-house and modified rendering scripts. All right, so there we go. That's kind of how our terrain's looking so far. It doesn't look spectacular because we don't have a whole lot of variety, we don't have a lot of elements in here. But you can see we can come in here and paint color. Now, we're going to leave it here for now so we can explore some of the other tools, but that's going to be how we can add color to it using the paint texture. Just remember, you need to create new layers here. You need to add layers, and then later on we'll talk about maybe adding these to new terrains and replacing them. I guess we could look at that now. If I were to create a new terrain here, and go to the paint texture section, you would see I don't have layers necessary. We could go to add layers and we could add these layers we've created. So I could select this and we could add that to it. And you can see the same thing here. We could add this layer to it. So these layers can be reused as we go throughout the game. Okay, so I'm going to delete that terrain. It created some junk data for us, but since this is just a tutorial project, no big deal. Let's go ahead and hop over here to paint trees. And the tree section, you can paint trees with this brush. You'll notice there's an edit tree section. We can click add tree here. And in here, you can look for a tree prefab. So if I go into my options here, I can look for tree and we can see if we have one. In this case, there was a bunch of plants that we could grab and we could see if we could find a plant prefab here. What I might do is leave this up, come into my 3D game kit here, into my prefabs, into my environment, and take a look at the vegetation, because I think that's what they called it. And I should be able to drag this vegetation into here. And you'll see that we can add that, we could click add, and now this is going to allow me to come into the terrain here, and I have the ability to paint this tree. So let's say I want an entire forest of these swamp trees, all I have to do is click my brush, and now I can utilize that. Now, I'm glad we're using the 3D game kit trees because it really pushes the point home that you can use whatever you want. So in this case, we have similar settings. We have a brush size, which is the size of our brush. We have things like tree density. This is how many trees are in a given brush stroke. So I'd probably let this be a bit lower, and then we can always click to kind of build this up. Other things we have are this tree height. You can see it has a random range dial. So these trees are already kind of large. If I go ahead and set this lower, you'll see we get smaller varieties, and if I wanted to make it so they could go larger, I could do that. And you can see I can come in here now and I can paint all of these. Now, there's a log height to width ratio check here. We're going to want to do that. If you uncheck that, it will make some wider and some higher. If I go ahead and make this super dramatic, you'll see that it will stretch and squash those. So it really depends on the tree. I actually don't think it looked too bad with that kind of set moderately to where it's just having some variation between the width. I'm okay with that. We also have this random tree rotation here that we can rotate, and we have this color variation, which I actually don't know what color variation's doing in this context. I don't know if it actually works with this asset. So we can take these here and we can paint them once we find a nice tree height we like. I could, maybe paint in some forests, some other scarce areas. And we can always add more trees. You can come in here to add tree, and we could add in another one of these funky trees here. Maybe we add in whatever this thing is, and we can click add, and we can start painting with this instead. And you'll see this one has a smaller height, so I can kind of intersperse it with the trees there. And now you can see how we're starting to get that integrated. And things like this are also going to help us kind of hide the tiling. That's one of the big factors here. Once you start adding in these trees and other rocks and visuals, it really helps sell this as a scene more than just random junk data. If we come over here to our plants, we can also add in some plant details. Now, if we come into the environments here and vegetation, This one here, the ground cover, I think these should give us what we're looking for in terms of the terrain. If we come into our settings here, we need to edit details, and we can add a detailed mesh or a grass texture. Now, a detailed mesh is actually a geometric mesh. So if I go ahead and add a detailed mesh here, this will allow us to add something with geometry. So I should be able to come in here and add in something like one of these funguses or one of these vegetation clusters. You'll notice LOD group components are not supported, so this might be one of those situations where I can't. But if I come in here and add the ground cover like this grass, you'll see it is accepted, and we can click add. And with that in place, if I select this here, we can paint this grass now, and you can see we can come in and paint these smaller details like grass into the scene. But more importantly is notice that grass is actually moving. And that's because it's clusters of little cards rather than geometry data. So you can see how we're painting that there. Now the other option here, the add grass texture, this will actually add in a billboard. It will add in an alpha texture. So if I go ahead and select grass here, I'm not sure if they have one set up for this. We could try something like this albedo grass, but if I go ahead and paint this, you'll see it's not three-dimensional like that. It creates these flat cards instead. It'd probably help if I hit add. So it creates these flat cards based on the texture instead. And in this case, it's actually painting that structure, which is not what we want. But if we were to set this up correctly, we could. And notice how they rotate with the camera. This is lower processing than this one here. This one here with actual three-dimensional cards, it looks better, but this is harder for the game engine to process at runtime. Now, there are some advantages to this one here that you can do. For example, if we go to edit details and we go to edit, you can change the multipliers here for different colors. You can change the mid-width, max width. So you can adjust all of these things just to kind of show, maybe we play around with some different colors here. I'll use black and red to see if this works, and then we'll just hit apply. And as we paint something like this, you'll see it will actually multiply that black and red color on it, where the unhealthy part is one color and the healthy part's another. If we come into this one and we edit the details on it, you'll notice we don't have that ability. So cards are a great way to add variety quickly, but the other option here to add a detail mesh is going to be a little bit nicer. So at this point, we have a relatively neat looking little terrain going here. Nothing super exciting that we can write home about, but we do have a base overview of the various tools here and how they work. So what I want to do next is I want to take a look at utilizing this with the 3D Game Kit to build a terrain environment for our level 2 that we added our laser gate to and we teleported our scene to see how we can make this compatible with our level. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let's go ahead and open up that level 2 of ours. We're going to just go to open scene here, and we're going to find that second sandbox here, which was sandbox 2. Open this up, and we're not going to save. Unless you want to save. If you made a cool terrain, feel free to. Now, why am I doing this inside of here? The reason I'm doing this inside of here is because this is where we have all our game mechanics. Remember, this is a template scene, so we need to see if we can make these work together. Now, we have our laser gate we built over here, and our character as well, which will give us a sense of scale for this scene. This plane, we don't really need, but I'm going to keep it just in case, and I'll go ahead and uncheck this so that way we don't see it. And what we'll do instead is we'll come in here to our game objects, our 3D object, and create terrain here to create a new terrain. So this will give me a terrain for the scene to take place in. You'll notice terrains are created from 0, 0, 0. In this case, I could move my terrain over, so we could center the character to be around the terrain here. Maybe we have them start in the center of this volume, but we can see the effect this is going to have. Now, before I get super deep into this and I start editing this like crazy, one of the things that can be good to confirm is whether or not this character can walk on terrain. So hitting play is probably step 1 of our journey here before we get excited and start sculpting this. And you'll notice we have a bit of an issue. So why is that? It has to do with flags. Right now, this is not flagged as anything. But if I go ahead and flag this as environment, that should allow her to collide with the terrain now. And once she can do that, we can run around the terrain and see how it looks. So now you'll see that our character has been unleashed on our terrain and now has the ability to come and explore this new world that she is in. So when starting terrain for a level, it's often a good idea to start at the 0, axes in the play area. So we're going to make it so she's not going to be swallowed whole, and maybe find something that's the right scope for our level. This level is very large. I don't want to paint anything this big, so remember we can come to the settings here and we can tone this back. That's going to be down here in the terrain. I'm going to see what 250 by 250 looks like, if that's too small for her or not. It looks like it is, so maybe we'll set this to be like 1,000 by 1,000. Something modest that isn't too wild. And we'll just come in and sculpt some detail. So I'll come into my sculpting. We can come to our brush here. We can come to our razor lower terrain. And I'll start by building up the mountains in the far distance. So let's just make our brush bigger. And we can go ahead and build these up. I'm going to increase the opacity dramatically. And we can go ahead and make these hills in the distance to kind of surround our character. So as our characters here, they feel like they're actually in a three-dimensional world. Now, this is where it'd be nice to maybe find some different brushes that look nicer. These brushes that Unity ships with, they're okay. You know, you can definitely get an okay result. But they do kind of give us this very jaggedy, fluffy, soft-looking look to this. So sometimes it's nice to utilize something a bit different. I'll utilize this to kind of build some of these up, give that sense of large sci-fi mountains of some sort. And then when we come into here, we can play around with some of these areas. So we could maybe just switch this over to set height, maybe set it to 1, a height of 1, to kind of just lift the entire area. And this is also an interesting trick I can show you guys. For example, like, what if we wanted to make this like an exterior swamp level? Like, we wanted to add water. We'd have to have her not start at 0, 0, because 0, 0 would need to be able to be the water area. So you could build up the entire level to have a certain height and then lift her and any other elements to that level. In this instance, though, I think we're just going to go with some rolling hills. So I'm just going to add in some basic, height build up here. We'll go ahead and set the next one to maybe 2. And this time around, introduce some hills. And I might start building up naturally after this. I don't want to take too long on this. I want to give you all your chance to explore and have fun with it. This is mainly just, hey, this is how we can go about doing this type of video. So let me go ahead and increase this over here. We can increase these, maybe make it more visually interesting for us. And we could also give her some obstacles to run around. Right now I've kind of built up the surroundings, so that way maybe she can't get out of here. I'd have to set up some specific colliders too, just to let you guys know. I haven't set up any specific colliders here, so everything that's going on here is relatively arbitrary. What do I mean by that? Depending on the settings, she's basically just going to be able to goat simulator up that hill. That's what I'm getting at. Let me come in here now to our set height. This is a great example of where set height to 0 is useful. I've kind of made my main area a bit muddy here. I could set that. And as a matter of fact, using the set height to 0, this would be an interesting way to kind of carve a pathway through this terrain to a specific destination. So let's say I wanted to place a gate there, I could. And then we could utilize different techniques to kind of pat that down. So for example, if I come into the razor lower terrain here, I could use shift to kind of carve these in, maybe larger or smaller, to kind of give this effect of this gradually fading into these areas. And just for the sake of demonstration, we could also maybe make a lake in here. So I could reduce this down, for example, but have the area around it elevated. And we could play around with introducing a lake or something like that in terms of our terrain, and maybe have a bit of a hill here to play around with this. Now, to make a really nice result, you probably will need to add a lot of custom brushes. But now that we have this all in place, let's take a look at the play button and just see what it's like to run around this terrain before we add some color to it and maybe some trees and context. So you'll see now, much more interesting looking, and if we come in here, you can see how long it takes to get from one point to another, but we should be able to come in here, we should be able to jump and move around in this new world we've created that's completely unique from the 3D Game Kit tools, and gives us a unique experience that we wouldn't normally get. So now you can see she has the reign of the world, and it's not just our sad little laser gate here anymore. We actually have other really cool stuff going on that we can play around with. Now, in terms of texturing, let's just throw some textures on this to have them. If you guys wanted to branch out and have something a little bit more creative, you could utilize your own tileable textures. You could go ahead and make those to match the style. But since we're just looking at terrain today, let's just use what we have. We can come into the paint terrain here, and just like we did before, we can come into edit and add layers, since we already have the ones. And I could add in the ground layer, for example, and that will add the ground to everything. I could then come in and edit, add layers, and we could add the moss here. And I could paint some moss to kind of maybe make the hills have some variety here and make it so we're not looking at the same thing the whole time. And I could keep digging through the 3D Game Kit to see if there's other textures that we could utilize, but for the time being, I'll just go ahead and utilize these and use them to maybe add some visual interest to the distance and my strange alien world that we've dropped our character into here. So we definitely would want to get more variety in here for an entire terrain than just these two textures, but you got to work with what you got. Maybe I'll make it nice and lush and green around this area since I plan to put a lake. But if we take a look at that now and hit play, we should see that we have green texture and we have color. Now, this will give you a better idea of how tiles feel as well once you get into here and you're based in this world. You can see that is a very different feel than the checkerboard. We can also see the pattern very repeated here. So we can start to break that up by adding in other elements. So let's go ahead and add in tree elements, since we've seen that. We can come to add tree here just like we did before, and I really do like those large trees we have in the vegetation here. So let's go to the vegetation large. We can take a look at these trees here. I'm a pretty big fan of those. And we can add these in and we can paint them. Now what's nice is this time around, we can see them relative to our character. So we can decide what height we want those to be, and we want to be careful painting them around her. But something like that, you know, is okay. I might even allow them to be a bit taller, and we might utilize these trees in different ways. You know, what kind of trees are these? What environment do they live in? Are they going to be a little bit of everywhere? Do I want to make one big brush here and just kind of stamp a bunch at once? So if I go ahead and make a big brush size here, you can see I can just brush a bunch of these at once, kind of spread out and less clustered. And, you know, what impact is this going to have on the performance and visuals of this particular scene? Now, for this one, let's go ahead and add in some variety. These are our large vegetations. Maybe around her, we go ahead and add in the dead tree, which is this funky little guy, or maybe we tried this one out. We'll go ahead and add this one because it looks fun. And maybe in the camp area here, we add some of these smaller trees and use those in maybe brown areas to create variety. And then after that, let's move over and add in some grass. So we'll go ahead and just edit details here. We'll add a detailed mesh just like we did before. Navigate over here to my vegetation. We'll go ahead and get our ground cover, just add that in. And in this instance, I can probably go nuts just painting this grass in. You'll see there's a lot of it, so we'll just have some fun. Can even cover the entire scene if we wanted to. And we can just see how it affects performance. You can see zoomed out, we don't see it. That's because it's kind of culling it, meaning it's removing it visually. But you can see we can go nuts and painting our grass all over the scene here. Now, there's a good chance you could create like a proprietary script to do this as well, to place the grass. We'd want to take more time on a area per area basis, kind of crafting the way it looks. And that's where those terrain swatches might come in handy. But as a shotgun approach goes, you can see we can come in here and we can just add these elements to get some more life to our scene. So, wow, did that make a difference? This is the interesting part of terrain. At this point, you can see, even though we only have 2 tileable textures, you can't really notice. With the ground in place and all the other elements, quite a big difference this is making. I will say I don't quite like how it made these trees super squatty. Those don't look amazing. And I also am not quite sold on the mountains in the background. Also, some of the trees going up the mountains I'd want to remove. But I would say overall, even though we only have 2 textures, this is actually starting to look like a playable world, which is quite amazing. Now, what are some adjustments we can do here? You can remove trees. I haven't talked about that yet. These trees that are on the mountain here, if I hold down Shift, I can remove. So we could come in here and we could remove the trees by using Shift. And I need to change my brush size. For whatever reason, the same brush size hotkey doesn't work on the trees. I don't know what to say about that, other than it'd be nice if these things were consistent, but yeah. Well, there you go. So we could come in here and we could shift to remove some of these trees if we don't like them, if we feel like there's too many. And the same goes with the other alien trees, but you could do so with the grass too. If you don't like some of the grass, for example, we think the grass is too intense, you can hold Shift to remove. Or if we wanted to carve a path, for example, I could use Shift here to carve a path so that we have this idea of where the character might need to travel through the grass, or that there's some sort of a story, like there's maybe native animals, like those chompers moving through this grass, and we could create little pathways visually for the character to follow using Shift. So if you take a lot of time with it, you can create some really cool game storytelling stuff here. We could have multiple converging pathways that maybe the character wants to follow, maybe loop around some of our other plans so they feel integrated and have fun with that. Now, another thing I noticed is that our character can't collide with the plants that this is painted on the terrain. So we'd have to sort that out to figure out why that is. I'm not entirely sure in that regard. If we go into the edit trees here and we edit settings, we could see if maybe there's an option here. You can see nav mesh LOD index. I'm not sure if that might be it. So we might have to maybe just recalculate nav mesh. There's also a button here I didn't show you guys called mass place trees, and if you go ahead and click that, it will place a bunch of these randomly in the scene, and it will pick between all your trees. So we could have added in every type of tree and mass place them as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at that just to kind of see. What I'll do is I'll make my brush huge, and I'll just shift click here to remove all these trees. So that way we get rid of all of them. And we could come into the vegetation here on our settings here. We could go to edit, add tree, and we could just start placing these into here and just clicking add and get a really nice variety of trees placed in our scene in an instance. So, there's a lot of different workflows you guys could figure out for this. This is going to be kind of a more lazy one, but something that can be useful a lot of the times is being less deliberate in our artwork and letting a machine take over initially and then coming in and fine-tuning it. So since we know we can remove these with Shift, if I come in here and we just mass place these, and you'll see it's going to place 10,000, I could come in and I could customize and remove those from the scene. So for example, if I wanted them to not be on the hills, in theory, I could make my brush smaller, and we could go ahead and shift, and we could remove them from the backside here of these areas. So these areas are never going to get rendered. We could go ahead and remove those. And then other areas that we find important, I could come in here and I could remove these from as well. So for example, around the base starting point, which I've completely lost because there's so many trees, we could look for where our Ellen is, and I think that's her visual effects there. And we could clear out some of these trees here so that we have a bit of a clearing heading into here. And just like I've mentioned before, if we wanted a distinctive pathway now for these to follow, so I kind of have this canyon here I've made, I could shift drag and I could clear these out. Now, one thing that's not so great about this, though, with the mass place is that there is no deliberate placement of these trees. meaning that they don't really have a distinctive purpose of being a swamp tree or a desert tree or a forest tree. They're just kind of a cluster of alien trees. If we come over to these, you can see you can't mass place these, which is funny because this would probably be more useful to mass place, but we can hit play now and we can see the results we get. So at this point, you know, it's going to be much more interesting and robust. There's a whole lot more plants going on here in terms of the world. We can't collide with them, though, so I'd probably have to do some research to see how we could get that to work with 3D game kits. It could be that these prefabs don't have colliders built in, or, you know, maybe something's not registering. We do have the layer system, so maybe there's something in that I'd have to change. But you can see how, with just this handful of textures, this is coming out quite nicely. The hills, on the other hand, need some love, so we'd have to figure that out. But just in terms of a navigatable alien space, this is starting to look like a game, which is really neat. So, in terms of the terrain, that's about all we need to know, but from game design, we can start incorporating other elements into this as well. So, we have this area here that I was going to make into our pond. Let me go ahead and just turn that into our actual pond here. I'll go ahead and shift to clean up those trees. We could introduce other game elements now. So if I come in my prefabs, there's no reason I couldn't come in here to my environment prefabs, into my water, and bring in water. So in terms of this, we have this water temp. I could go ahead and try this out, see what it looks like. And you'll see what I'm doing here is I'm just crashing it into the terrain, and I might need to build up the terrain around it to create a lake effect. But really all this is a polygon plane, and as we increase or decrease the level here, it shows through the various holes in the terrain we created to create the illusion of being a body of water or a lake. So kind of like the acid pit that we did in the earlier section of the 3D game kit. Now this area is being problematic for me, so I'll just come in and nudge this up in the sculpting here. We can come in here, make sure we have our raise or lower terrain, and I'll just raise that slightly. Notice the trees stick to the terrain, so there's no loss there, which is pretty cool. And I could even come in here and carve this to have, you know, little tributaries going down into the water if I wanted to, after placing the water. But now we have that water in there. Now, one thing we will have to be conscious of with this water is whether or not we can go on it. And this is where creating that death volume might be a good idea. You guys saw how to do that with the poison water, so I'm not going to go through it here. But I do want to show that you can add that. Now, we can also add in other environment elements too. There's no reason we can't come in here and start adding in structures just like we did previously. Let me get out of our view here. So this is where we could play around with things. You know, if I wanted to come in here and add pillars, for example, there's no reason I couldn't add pillars into this level to add a sense of mystery. I could even crash in staircases into the building or walls to kind of indicate maybe there was like a temple here and it was eaten by the terrain or a landslide. So something like that. You can see little stairs kind of sticking out. We could maybe slap Cthulhu at the top here, looking down at the scene, and just come in here and place it with our 3D placement tools. That way we have access to this, and maybe, you know, this is the scene of where there was a water temple once. You can create your narrative, but we can add in our structures there. We could even add in things like stonework and rock. This is where, you know, we might even be able to play with some of these on a more extreme level. I don't know how extreme, but various areas like the cliffside, you know, how big can we push one of these? Could we potentially use these, you know, instead of these mountains and just crash these into the terrain? I don't know how good that would look. It looks like the texture scale probably doesn't hold up quite correctly, but we might be able to get away with something like that, maybe. But I think the scaling looks off. If we were to come down here Doesn't look like it LODs correctly. But we could add those in, and we could utilize these instead of the maximum height of the terrain. And I think that's kind of important to note, because in our first scene, I kind of used a bunch of these to kind of crash into the side. And we could do the same thing using a variety of these different types of rocks at different scales to kind of build the walls of our scene while still utilizing the terrain tools for everything else. We could also just have these be a subset of the terrain and, you know, actually be part of the structure. So for example, if I wanted to have more of a rugged cliff wall here, I could incorporate these into here by crashing them into the terrain and utilizing them in different ways. I don't think this is quite as successful as some of the other areas, but those are things we could add in. And even these like half pieces that are like missing the backside, this is probably an area where these would even accelerate even more, because who cares if they're missing a backside when we could just crash that backside into terrain or even sculpt up and around these to make them viable pieces of geometry. So this might add even more visual interest. For example, here, having a ledge like that sticking out from this area. So you can integrate these in a lot of different ways. A lot of fun stuff we can do with this kit. And like I mentioned, we can start adding in gameplay elements even. You know, if I wanted to create structures in the river here, like I mentioned, some sort of a temple that you might have to get to. Maybe we set it up so that the water's a death trap if you fall into it, but there's a temple in the center and you have to activate platforms that'll let you get there. You can incorporate all this stuff that we've utilized. So let's go ahead and give it one last run around here. I think this is a pretty fun end result. Our laser gate feels a little bit out of place here, so we might have to give that some sort of a purpose other than just being a demo asset. But if I look around now, we can see our structures. So over here we have our Call of Cthulhu, our statue. We can go ahead and see if we can climb up to. And I don't know how vertical she can go. You know, some of these hills she might not be able to get up. That's going to be also kind of a nav mesh thing. If we look for the character's nav mesh, we might be able to adjust that. But you can see here's our statue, so we're able to navigate to it. And you can see how the world's feeling much more open now. Terrain's kind of the key to open world. We can see our lake over there. So let's go check out our lake. And I can show you guys the problem with our lake, which is it's not a depth volume, so we can either walk on it or who knows. We'll see. But you can see it looks like water, which is pretty cool. If I jump in it, though, it's not water. We need to add a whole lot of visual effects in a water system if you wanted your character to be able to swim or something like that. So generally speaking, what we could do here is make it an area the player can't go. You could do that with an actual collider a lot of the times. I'm not sure with how this is doing environmental flags, though. But this is where, you know, we might be able to come in and create something like an empty object, create empty. We could just make this our barrier. And in this case, you know, I'd add a component like a box collider to this, and edit the collider itself. For the size, I'm just going to set this to 1000 by 1000 by 1000 to begin with, so that way we can see it. All right, so that's very large. So maybe 100 by 100 by 100 is more accurate. And we could try moving this into position and shaping it to be the shape of the water. This will take a minute to do. And in reality, I'd probably want to use several box colliders. But we could just set up a box collider to prevent her from entering this area altogether, is the idea. I'm having a hard time visualizing it here, since it's in 3 dimensions, but we could do that. We could also create like an exclusion mesh that's the right size, so I'll just leave it at that. But hopefully that gives you some ideas on how we can approach the terrain here and ways we can use it with our 3D game kit. That is our look at Unity's terrain tool and how we can integrate it into the 3D game kit. As you can see, the terrain tool offers a vast, intuitive way to create detail and natural landscapes for your game. So experiment with different sculpting techniques, texture blending techniques, and foliage placement to bring your world to life. Try bringing outside textures in. the best way to do it with terrains is just use tileable textures. That way they repeat infinitely and you don't have any issues, but it'd be great to get something in there for the mountains. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe and let me know in the comments what kind of environment you're building. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.